So I'm going to talk a little bit about social enterprise and service delivery, then I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology of the study. And this study is really very much, at the time I had to write this paper, a work in progress. We're getting to the more final stages now, but what I'm going to present is still, it's very much just the raw data and not really much statistical analysis at this stage. And but I'll talk about that a little more in detail later because we only finished the survey at the beginning of March and finished including the data before I came here. So, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I think are some of the potential and limitations of social enterprise in the context of service delivery in Colombia and Mexico. As I mentioned, this is part of kind of embedded in a larger research project, and the research attempts to kind of give a glimpse into what social enterprise looks like in these 4 countries, because we use the word social enterprise in a lot of different ways, but no one's really sure what it actually means. Is it nonprofit? Is it for-profit? Is it somehow those 2 things put together? So the objectives of carrying out this survey was to really kind of get an initial idea of what are the characteristics of social enterprise, what factors might contribute to the existence and emergence of social enterprise, what role are they playing in providing basic services and reducing poverty, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of social enterprise as compared to, say, the traditional nonprofit sector or the for-profit sector or the public sector. And who are they competing and collaborating with? So why social enterprise in the first place, right? Why are we even talking about this? Well, there's kind of a discussion in the literature that there's declining confidence in the nonprofit NGO sector. There's an ineffectiveness and inefficiency in development aid, and social enterprise maybe can correct that. I'm not so sure. And in this context, it's been argued by some scholars and also promoters of social enterprise that the only kind of legitimate option for a nonprofit organization is to kind of convert itself into a social enterprise. And this has been reinforced through a lot of development programs, including the Inter-American Development Bank, which has worked for a long time, particularly in Mexico on the social enterprise sector. They've also expanded to Colombia. The World Bank is also running a program on social investing, as well as the UN, as well as USAID. So it's becoming kind of a popular term, and also they are attracting a lot of attention in terms of gaining funding and financing from the international development aid sector. So, as I mentioned, social enterprise is kind of an eclectic term, and there's a kind of wide range of organizations that refer to themselves as social enterprise, which makes it a little confusing and difficult to analyze. So you have, this is just kind of a scale of what kind of organizations that we have in the survey that run anywhere from a nonprofit, as we would think of a traditional NGO or nonprofit that has no commercial or market-oriented activities, to nonprofits that kind of integrate commercial activities, but then they reinvest all that money right back into the organization. We see a lot, and this is kind of becoming a new form of hybrid, what we call hybrid organizations, where they'll found 2 separate types of organizations, a nonprofit and a for-profit, that are kind of like sister organizations, so that they can capture both the funding and the contracts that would traditionally go to a nonprofit organization, but at the same time they have a sister organization that's a for-profit, which allows them to capture the funding from these types of programs for social enterprise and social investment. And then you have those that are just for-profit, but they've got a social mission. They say that they need a double bottom line. And then you have organizations that are really kind of on this bottom of the pyramid scale kind of thing, where they're really just for-profit organizations, but somehow their mission is something social, like, but the profit maximization is clearly the number one goal. So I'll talk a little bit about the methodology, because of that scale, it was really hard to come up with, well, how do we measure or even look at the social enterprise sector, since it contains all these different kinds of organizations, and there's no register, or there's no legal form for a social enterprise in any of the countries. that we were working in. So the way we came up with, and it's maybe, I don't know, there are different ways to do this. A lot of previous studies on social enterprise, they've set some criteria about, for example, in that scale, what they consider social enterprise. So they would put some boundaries there. And what we decided to do was actually not to put boundaries on it, but actually to see, well, who's calling themselves a social enterprise, or is there an organization in terms of like a social investor or a development agency that calls them a social enterprise? And we came up with that actually because I went to a bunch of meetings with some Ashoka fellows and that who were social enterprises, and a lot of the things, the first things they said were, I didn't know I was a social enterprise or a social entrepreneur until Ashoka came and told me I was one. So we decided to kind of have a more open concept. And so the way we did that is there are a lot of organizations like the development agencies, the World Bank, the IDB, as well as GIN and Ashoka, Aspen, development entrepreneurs, and we went to them and we asked them to help us develop a sample of social investors. And so we developed a sample of social investors, and then we went to the social investors and we got the list of the social enterprises they've invested in. So it's kind of like a self-referential model. So it's like who's referring or who refers to themselves as a social enterprise. And through that, we were able to come up with about 44 social investors. We have over 100 social investors, but only 44 were working in the Latin American context. We found around about 1,000 social enterprises. And about half of them were in Mexico and Colombia. So of that half, what I'm going to show in this part of the presentation is actually, we did the survey in two parts. Well, we did two surveys, and I'm going to only focus on one. We did the survey in two parts, an online survey, and then we moved to a telephone survey. And what I'm going to present here is just the online survey because we didn't finish the telephone survey in time. So just to give you an idea of what the social enterprise sector looks like a little bit. So you can see actually it's not so old. Most of the organizations are relatively new. They're working in a variety of sectors that deliver basic services, among other things. Primarily, actually, we found that they're working a lot in education and actually in healthcare, at least in these two countries. We think actually as we dive a little deeper into the data that what we're going to see, or what we hypothesize that we'll see, is that the organizations that are found kind of in the latter spectrum are probably going to tend to be more for-profit because of the change in the funding mechanism that's happened in the development agencies, and that the older organizations are probably going to be more non-profit. But as you can see, and part of the reason is because the organizational form is actually a little bit, it's kind of more or less evenly split. You have about overall 46% or so registered as nonprofits. Hybrid again is this where they set up two organizations. So again, I think that the hybrids are going to probably be newer organizations and the for-profits. What's a little interesting is that, and this actually we didn't expect to find, we thought it would be the opposite between Colombia and Mexico, because Colombia has a little bit of a stronger public service sector, and so we thought that we would find more nonprofits in Colombia, and actually we find the opposite, that Mexico actually has more nonprofits. But this might be an age issue, because I think the concept of social enterprise has been a little deeper and longer in Mexico. So we also asked them a little bit about how they place themselves on this kind of social and financial spectrum. Like how do they balance their social return? Because the objective of social enterprise is to kind of have this double bottom line. And you know, when you do a Likert scale, you kind of expect this, that everyone kind of fits in the middle. So most click in the middle, but again, what's interesting is that Colombia tends to actually tend a little more towards the profit maximization than Mexico does. And given, again, the country context, we found that a little bit surprising. So once we dive into the data a little bit, it'll be interesting if we can come up with some reasons on why we're seeing that. Then we also asked them, because social enterprises are supposed to target the BOP, They're supposed to be working really at the bottom of the pyramid. And are they really getting at the BOP? And actually, rather not. And this is obviously because they have to, or a big chunk of them, have to earn money. And even if they're earning money as a nonprofit and reinvesting it, if they're working at the BOP, they need to be then completely subsidizing the service, and that's not happening. So this kind of calls into question on whether social enterprise is really a good alternative to a public service, or a service that has kind of public attributes. At the same time, they're definitely working in areas that aren't served. So maybe they're not getting really at the bottom, but they're definitely covering gaps in the market or in the public service delivery where people wouldn't ordinarily otherwise have access. So that's, I think, an important thing. And then I'll finish up because I think this is going to cut me off the time. So the other thing that I want to talk about, this just covers some things, but also like who are they competing with? And the interesting thing here is, again, is, as I mentioned, they're working in areas where the public sector is not there, like they're not functioning. So they're competing mostly with nonprofits. Some say they have no competitors at all. I mean, that's the second largest category. And what's interesting is, though, they do have some kind of, not a formal partnership, but some type of collaboration with government, or a lot of them. I mean, half say they're not involved at all, but another, not quite half, but say that they have some kind of engagement, either through the promotion of their operations, they receive some kind of tax advantage because they're a nonprofit, or the delivery or the consumption of the service is facilitated by the government. And then the last one was we asked about partnerships, because we were interested, well, who are they partnering with? So they're competing mostly with for-profits. They're not partnering so much with them. They're partnering mostly in the nonprofit sector, and a little bit with also the public sector. So this would be a little more interesting to delve into. So again, this is very much a work in progress. I just wanted to give kind of a brief glimpse. We're still kind of delving into the data, which is just recently finished up, but it's not really clear, or it seems that they're not really, I would say, from my first impressions for working on this project over the last 3 years, actually looking into social enterprise, is that, the claim is always that they're more efficient, they're more effective than traditional NGOs or nonprofit sector or the public sector. But I would say, a first glimpse into the data, and this is only a little slice of the data we have that I presented, really shows that they're not. What they are doing is they're functioning in places where people wouldn't ordinarily have access, and I think that's an important point, although they're not really getting to the bottom of the pyramid. I think the big distinction between a social enterprise and a traditional for-profit and a traditional nonprofit is the funding mechanism. It's about who they can access funding. It's not that they behave so differently from a for-profit or a nonprofit, depending on which side of the spectrum they fall into it, but it's about attracting this investment. If I call myself a social enterprise, I can get access to a social investor, or a social investor, for whatever reason, thinks I'm a social enterprise, and then they come tap me like a shoulder and say, you're a social entrepreneur, we're going to make an investment in you. So it's really about kind of playing this funding, financing game. The questions, it brings into questions as a role between civil society and the public sector, whether or not they would increase their collaboration or the potential to increase collaboration with the public sector in order to scale, because most of them are operating on a really limited, small-scale basis, and one of the ways they might be able to have a larger reach is through a collaboration with the public sector and co-construction of social policy. And the last main point I want to talk about is what we were talking about in terms of mission drift. The social enterprise is supposed to start out with this balance between the social and the financial. And I think that most of them do start out with this objective of obtaining both goals, maybe not equally, but in some kind of equilibrium. But because of the financing structure, as the financing structure becomes more profit-oriented and investment-oriented, I think that if you look at social enterprise, and this is just one, the survey doesn't do this because it's one snapshot in time, but if we were, I think, to follow up in some years, it would be really interesting to see how this drift is. When you have the pressure for a return on your investment, but you have to give back, either to a bank with IDE or an NGO like Acción, the pressure to produce profit is there, and so you're probably going to witness a mission drift, whereas the financial objective starts to overtake the original social and financial objective. And this, I think, gets into a little bit of a dangerous game, especially when you're talking about basic needs and public services, which is what they're supposed to be providing. And I think with that, I'm done.